It was the summer of 2019 when I decided to take a break from everything. My name's Mark, I was 34 at the time, working in a small welding shop in Ohio, the kind of place where weeks roll into months and you stop noticing. I'd been living a pretty simple life, wake up early, go to work, come back home, maybe have a beer, sleep, repeat. Nothing was really wrong, but nothing felt right either. Something about that year felt heavier than usual. I hadn't taken any time off in a long time. I wasn't sleeping well. I was burnt out in every way. Then one weekend in June, I remembered a cabin my uncle used to own. It was way out near the Pennsylvania border, about 3 hours away from where I lived. I hadn't been there in probably 15 years. My uncle had passed away in 2006, and nobody had really used the cabin since. It wasn't in the family anymore. I think it was sold off during some legal mess when he died. But I figured maybe it was still there, still standing. Maybe empty, maybe quiet. I didn't plan on staying long. I just wanted to drive out there, see it again, sit in the woods for a bit, clear my head. So that Saturday, I packed some basic things into the back of my old Silverado. Sleeping bag, water, protein bars, flashlight, a folding knife, a small camping stove, and left before the sun came up. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Not because I wanted to disappear or anything like that. I just didn't think it mattered. The drive out was peaceful. I stuck to the back roads, windows down, warm breeze coming through. I passed little towns I'd forgotten about, long stretches of trees, and hills that rolled forever. Everything looked the same and completely different at once. The closer I got to the place, the more I started remembering the little things. Playing cards on the wooden porch with my cousin, my uncle gutting fish down by the stream, the smell of pine and mildew inside the old cabin. Took some time to find it. The roads back there weren't marked anymore. I had to stop a couple times and walk a bit just to see if I was still on the right trail. Trees had grown in, and what used to be gravel roads were now just soft dirt and patches of moss. But eventually I saw it. The cabin. It was still there, but it was different. Older, obviously, sagging more. The wood looked gray, almost silver in places, like it had been bleached by the sun and snow for years. Some of the windows were broken. The door hung crooked. A part of the roof near the back corner had caved in, but it was still standing. There was no driveway left. Grass and brush had taken over everything around it. I parked the truck as close as I could without getting it stuck and walked the last 50 yards through knee-high weeds. Birds scattered as I got closer. It felt like the place had been asleep, and I was waking it up. I walked around the outside first. The back half of the cabin looked worse. One of the support beams had shifted, and the whole structure leaned just slightly to one side. The deck out front was warped and cracked, but I tested it with my weight and it held. I opened the door slowly. It didn't even have a lock on it anymore, just a rusty handle and splintered frame. It made a low scraping sound as it swung open, like it was dragging on the floor inside. The smell hit me immediately. Old wood. Wet dirt. Something sour, like animals had been living in there and died. I stepped inside anyway. Everything was coated in dust. The little kitchen area still had some old tin cans on the counter. A small table and 2 chairs were in the center of the room. One chair was broken. There were rat droppings in the corner and what looked like the remains of a bird's nest on top of the old wood stove. The place was trashed, but it was quiet, and I wanted quiet. I set my bag down and opened the windows that still had glass in them. It didn't help much, but at least I could hear the wind outside. I sat on the floor and leaned back against the wall, just listening. It was peaceful. For the first couple hours, I just stayed there. I didn't feel like doing anything else. I didn't even bother unpacking properly. I walked a bit through the trees nearby, down to the edge of the stream we used to fish at. It was still flowing, slower than I remembered, but still clear and cold. I sat on a rock, ran my hands through the water, stared at the trees. I didn't see another person all day.
No campers, no hikers.
Nothing. That night, I made a small fire in a rusty old ring outside the cabin. I used dry twigs and some of the broken chair legs for kindling, ate one of the protein bars, drank some water, and just sat there watching the flames move. I didn't even feel like sleeping, but once it got dark enough, I climbed inside the cabin and laid out my sleeping bag on the part of the floor that felt the least rotten. That first night, I slept okay. Not great, but better than I had in weeks. I woke up early with the light coming through the cracks in the wall. There were noises outside, just birds, wind in the trees, maybe a rabbit rustling through the grass. I boiled water on my camping stove for some instant coffee and walked the area again. That's when I found something strange. Behind the cabin, maybe 20 or 30 yards into the trees, I found a small clearing. I didn't remember it from before. Maybe the trees had changed, or maybe I'd just forgotten. In the center of the clearing was an old barrel, one of those big, rusted metal drums people sometimes used for burning trash. Except this one wasn't empty. Inside there were bones, not animal bones. At least not just animals. They were charred, burned black, mixed with melted plastic, broken glass, pieces of fabric. It looked like someone had tried to destroy a bunch of things. Most of it was impossible to tell apart. But the bones, some of them were clearly long, like a human arm or leg. There were even teeth. I stood there for a long time just looking at it. My heart started beating faster. My mouth went dry. I looked around the woods. Suddenly the quiet didn't feel peaceful. Felt wrong. I took a few steps back, then turned and walked straight to the cabin. I thought about leaving right then, just packing my things and getting back in the truck. But I didn't. I wish I had. But something about it all made me stay. I told myself maybe it was old. Maybe some hunter burned a deer in there and I was just being paranoid. But I knew that wasn't right. That day I didn't go far. I stayed close to the cabin, keeping my ears open. I didn't see or hear anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every time the wind moved the branches, I flinched. Every crack of a twig made me turn around. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something deeper, a slow pressure building in my chest. That second night was worse. Couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the barrel, about the bones, about who might have put them there. I left the windows open again so I could hear if anyone was coming. Around midnight, I heard movement outside. It wasn't an animal. The steps were too heavy, slow, deliberate. I didn't move. I just laid there, frozen, holding my breath. The steps came closer, then stopped. I heard something tapping lightly on the wall outside. Not knocking, just tapping, like fingernails or metal against wood. Then silence. I waited an hour before I even sat up. When I finally worked up the courage to go outside, nothing was there. Just trees and the dark outline of the woods. But something was different. The fire ring I used earlier that day had been disturbed. The rocks around it were moved. One of the chair legs I had burned was lying a few feet away, unburned. The ashes were scattered. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I packed everything and left the cabin. I didn't bother cleaning up. I didn't look back. I got in the truck and drove, hitting every bump in the road as fast as I could without losing control. My hands were shaking. My shirt was soaked in sweat. I didn't stop driving until I was back on the main road, until I saw other cars, other people. I didn't even go home right away. I parked at a gas station and sat there for an hour, just trying to calm down. When I got back to my apartment that night, I didn't unpack. I didn't shower. I just laid on the couch, staring at the ceiling. I didn't sleep at all. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about that barrel, about the steps, about the tapping. I kept expecting to see someone outside my window, but no one ever came. Eventually, I told myself it was just some local using the old cabin for who knows what. Drugs, maybe, or hiding something. Either way, I wanted nothing to do with it. 2 weeks later, I went to the police. Not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't sleep. I told them I'd been hiking near the border and found something strange. I gave them rough directions. I didn't say it used to be my uncle's cabin. I didn't want to get pulled into anything. They said they'd send someone to check it out. I never heard back. Months passed, then a full year. I moved to a different apartment, changed jobs, tried to forget. But sometimes when I'm alone and it's really quiet, I hear that tapping again. Not loud, just soft, like it's coming from the wall behind me. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I see that barrel again. The bones, the teeth. That cabin should have collapsed years ago, but it didn't. It waited, and I wish I'd never gone back. I hadn't been back to that cabin in over 12 years, not since the divorce. And even then, I didn't think I'd ever go back. But after Lisa passed away, unexpected, in her sleep, some heart condition her doctors didn't catch, I felt something pulling me there. It wasn't love. We hadn't loved each other for years by the time we split. But something about that cabin, about what we built together out there, just stuck with me. It was early May 2022 when I made the drive. I was 47 by then, living alone in Missoula, Montana. I worked nights in a warehouse, kept to myself mostly, never remarried, didn't date. I had friends, sure, but nobody close enough to ask questions when I took a few days off and drove down south to the Idaho Panhandle, near Priest Lake, where the cabin sat in a thick patch of timber off a gravel road nobody ever plowed. Lisa and I had bought the place in 2007. Back then, it was just a rotting shack with no insulation and a roof that caved in if you stepped on it wrong. But we'd spent nearly 3 summers rebuilding it from the ground up. I did most of the work. She picked the furniture, the paint, the tile. I still remember the yellow pine trim she made me install even though I hated it. We didn't have kids, but we spent every fall up there hunting grouse or just watching the leaves burn gold through the windows. After the split, she got the cabin in the settlement. I never argued. By then, I couldn't stand to be around her. But part of me always wondered what she did with it. Whether she kept going, whether someone else went with her. I never asked. We stopped speaking completely after 2013. But then in March, I got a letter from her sister, Karen. It was short. Lisa had passed away. No will, no kids, nothing of value to pass on except the cabin. And now it was mine again. I didn't respond, just folded the letter, stuck it in a drawer, and let it sit there until the first week of May. That's when I finally packed up the truck with some tools, an old sleeping bag, a .22 rifle, and enough canned food to last 3 days. I had no plan. I just wanted to see it again. One last look before I decided whether to sell it or burn it down. The drive took most of the day. I passed through Coeur d'Alene just before dark and kept going north through the winding back roads. The trees got taller, thicker, darker. By the time I turned onto the gravel road that led to the cabin, the sky had gone a pale gray blue, the kind of color that meant rain wasn't far. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. No cell service out there. No neighbors within walking distance. Just me and the trees and whatever memories were still soaked into those cabin walls. When I finally saw the roofline poking through the trees, something twisted in my chest. It looked older, leaning slightly to the right like it had sunk into the ground a bit more than it should have. The paint had peeled off most of the exterior. The yellow trim around the windows had faded to a sickly beige. I parked the truck beside the old fire pit, now half filled with moss and dead leaves, and walked up to the front door. The lock was still the same one I'd installed in 2008. I still had the key. Inside, the smell hit me first. Damp wood, mouse droppings, something like mold but not quite. The place had clearly been closed up for months, maybe years. Dust covered every surface. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling beams. The couch was the same. So was the rug, now eaten through by moths. Her books were still stacked neatly on the shelf. Same titles, same exact order. I walked through the cabin slowly, trying not to disturb anything. In the kitchen, I found a jar of peanut butter on the counter, half used, lid off. That struck me as odd. So did the cup of water beside the sink, dried out but still upright like someone had just been there. I checked the bedroom next. The bed was made. Fresh sheets, or at least clean looking. That didn't make sense. Lisa had been dead for 2 months by then. Who made the bed? I went back outside, circled the cabin. No tire tracks.
No footprints.
Just old grass and pine needles and the silence of deep woods. I was alone out there, and yet I had the strangest feeling that someone had been there just a few days ago. That first night, I couldn't sleep. I rolled out the sleeping bag in the living room and laid there listening to the creaks and groans of the old place settling. At some point after midnight, I heard movement on the roof. Not heavy, just soft scraping like fingernails on sheet metal. Then it stopped. I told myself it was a branch, maybe a raccoon, but the sound didn't return. The next morning, I started cleaning. I didn't know why. I just needed something to do. I swept the floors, opened the windows, lit a fire in the wood stove to dry out the musty air. I found some of Lisa's old clothes still folded in the dresser. Jeans, flannels, hiking boots, all in her size, all clean. It was like she'd been here just last week. Around noon, I walked the property. About 100 yards behind the cabin, I found something strange. There was a patch of earth that looked recently dug up and filled back in. The dirt was soft, darker than the rest. No grass growing on it yet. It was about 5 feet long, maybe too wide. My first thought was animal burial, but I hadn't seen any sign of a dog or cat in the cabin. No food bowls.
No liches.
No hair. I didn't dig it up. I didn't want to know. That night, I locked the doors. I even blocked the front door with the couch. I didn't know why, but my gut wouldn't let me relax. Around 3 a.m., I woke up suddenly, not from a noise, just that sick feeling you get when you know something is wrong. The fire had gone out. The cabin was pitch dark. The trees outside were dead silent. And then I heard it. Footsteps on the front porch. Slow, deliberate, one at a time. Boards creaking under weight. I held my breath. My rifle was beside me, leaned against the wall. I didn't move, just listened. Then the footsteps stopped. Nothing for a full minute. Then a soft knock. Just once. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then another knock. A little louder, followed by what sounded like breathing, right outside the door. Deep, slow, human. I waited, rifle aimed at the door, until the breathing stopped, until the sound of retreating steps faded into the woods.
I steiet av vacke till dawn.
In the morning, I found something on the porch, a photograph. It was of Lisa, standing in the same spot by the fire pit, smiling, holding a mug of coffee. The trees in the background were green, the light golden. Must have been taken early fall, maybe 2 years ago. On the back of the photo, in pencil, was a date, September 18th, 2020. And below that, in smaller letters, she didn't die here. That's when I realized something wasn't right with what I'd been told. If Lisa had died in her sleep at home, why was someone telling me she didn't? And who left the photo? I drove into town that day. Took me 45 minutes to get signal. I called Karen, her sister. When she picked up, she was quiet at first. I told her I was at the cabin, that someone had been there, that I found a grave behind the place. After a long pause, she said something I'll never forget. "We don't know where she died," she said. "We found her car parked at the trailhead near the lake. Search and rescue found some of her things, but not her. She disappeared. That's why the cabin went to you. Everyone assumed she was dead. Legally. They had to." I asked why she said Lisa passed away in her sleep. "Because that's what people want to hear," Karen said. "Clean story.
No mystery.
I didn't respond. I just hung up. That night, I walked back to the patch of earth behind the cabin, the one that looked fresh. I brought a shovel. I dug for over 2 hours. About 3 feet down, I hit a trash bag. Inside it was clothing. Lisa's clothes. Torn. Stained with something dark. A few inches deeper, I found a shoe. Then a bone. Then hair. I stopped. I covered it all back up. I packed my things. Left the cabin that night, didn't sleep. Drove until sunrise. Didn't stop for gas until I hit Spokane. I never told anyone what I found. Never went to the police. Never contacted Karen again. I sold the cabin that fall. Cash sale to a man from Oregon. Told him it needed work, but the land was good. He didn't ask questions. Sometimes I wonder who was knocking that night. If it was someone trying to scare me off, or someone trying to warn me. Other times, I wonder if Lisa had been out there alone. If she'd met someone who watched her for a while, who waited until the night was right. But mostly, I just try not to think about that photograph. The smile on her face, the way the trees behind her seemed too quiet, too still. She didn't die in her sleep, and I wasn't supposed to find out where she really did. My name's Jake Palmer. Back in 2013, I worked as a seasonal park ranger at a remote national forest near the Wind River Range in Wyoming. I was 27 at the time. Fresh out of a bad breakup and tired of city noise, I figured some quiet months in the backwoods might help reset my head. They assigned me to a fire watch and trail maintenance post, based out of a small cabin about 10 miles from the nearest service road. No cell reception, no visitors, just me, a shortwave radio, a wood stove, and a worn map full of trails, stream names, and elevation lines. It was late August when I got there. The days were still warm, the nights dipping into sweater weather. The forest had that dry pine smell you only get in the high country. There were moose and black bear out there, sometimes mountain lions. I saw their tracks. It didn't bother me. I had my rifle, my training, and a locked cabin with thick walls. The first couple weeks were what you'd expect. My days were spent hiking trails with a machete clearing deadfall, checking campsite conditions, and recording any signs of erosion or illegal activity. The Park Service had a habit of leaving one ranger up in the less trafficked areas during the fall months. Tourists thinned out, fires were a risk, and we still needed boots on the ground. There was an old logging road about 3 miles west of my cabin. It hadn't been used in decades. I found it on one of the old maps they'd left in the cabin's desk drawer. It wasn't on the laminated, updated ones the station issued me. The paper map had pencil notes in the margins and a faded stamp on the corner that said, U.S. Forest Service, 1981. You could barely read it anymore. That caught my curiosity. I decided to follow it one day. I packed light, just my radio, water, bear spray, a sidearm, and a granola bar. I left early, around 6:30 in the morning. I wanted to be back by early afternoon in case weather turned. That old road barely looked like anything now. Just 2 faint tire ruts running through the pine needles and dead grass. But the deeper I followed it, the more I saw old signs that someone had once tried to build something out there. Concrete chunks, rusted metal scraps, a few broken glass bottles, and what looked like the rotted frame of an old truck cab, nearly swallowed by trees. About 4 miles down, I came to a clearing. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a small parking lot. But in the center was a low, collapsed structure, logs stacked horizontally, with the roof caved in and some old metal chimney pipes still barely sticking out. I walked around it slowly. No wildlife tracks, no recent footprints. Everything was covered in dry pine needles and dust. When I crouched beside the log frame and looked inside, I saw what looked like an old potbelly stove, a metal cot frame, and several half-rotted wooden crates. It was a cabin, no doubt, probably built in the 60s or 70s by someone who wanted to live off-grid. There was no trail marker, no signs, no record of it in any ranger logs. I figured it had to be one of those forgotten ranger outposts or a squatter's retreat. What unsettled me was how intact everything was. The floorboards were gone in places, but not vandalized. Nothing had been burned. It was like whoever had built it simply walked off one day and never came back.
No gear, no clothes.
Not even tools. Just the shell of the cabin and the strange way the forest had grown tight around it. I stayed maybe 10 minutes, took photos, and logged the coordinates. My radio barely got a scratchy signal from that deep in, but I managed to transmit a simple report. Found old unmarked structure. Logging coordinates. Returning to post. Static was all I got back. I should have just let it be, but something pulled at me. That night I couldn't stop thinking about the place. Not in a fearful way at first, just off, like it had been buried and forgotten on purpose. I kept staring at the old paper map, trying to see if there was anything else marked near it. In one corner, written in pencil, were the words C19 cabin/sup, 1974 to 75 inch, and a small triangle next to it. It was exactly where I'd found the clearing. The next morning, I called into base camp with the satellite phone. I told them about the structure and asked if they had any record of it. They didn't. In fact, the supervisor I spoke to told me there were never any staffed ranger posts out there, at least not in the last 30 years. He said maybe it was a logging foreman's camp, but nothing was in their system. If it's unstable, mark it condemned. We'll follow up next season. I wasn't satisfied with that. For the next week, I went back to that site 3 more times. I didn't tell base. I just made up extra patrols on my daily logs. I brought gloves and cleared out some of the collapsed timber. The inside of the cabin wasn't large, just one room, no more than 10 by 12 feet. The crates inside were full of old tin cans, powdered milk, and matchboxes. A couple had U.S. Forest Service stencils on them. That gave me pause. One of the crates had a heavy metal box inside, locked and rusted shut. I took it back to my cabin. It took me a day and a half to get the box open using a hammer and a flathead screwdriver. Inside were folders, dozens of them. Most were water damaged, but a few were intact. They were reports, hand-typed, dated from 1973 to 1975. Most of them were labeled Observation Logs, Sector C. Others said, Predator Behavior, Atypical Patterns. It looked like whoever was out there was tracking animals. But the weird thing was the notes weren't scientific. They were frantic, almost paranoid. One log said, heard bipedal movement at 2:40 a.m. not consistent with elk or moose. No response to flares. Retreated to cabin and remained armed until daylight. Another read, tracks around latrine site, human shape, but irregular stride pattern. No signs of boots. Dragging left foot. It didn't make sense. Another entry mentioned that communication with base had been cut off for 13 days due to storm damage, but I couldn't find any corresponding record of storms that month. The last page was dated April 3rd, 1975. It said, I will not return to the upper sector. I've done my duty. I've burned the rest. Let them cover it up. There was no name, just the initials HK. That's when I stopped sleeping well. Every sound outside my cabin started to feel like a threat. The wind in the trees, the thump of pine cones on the roof. I stopped hiking past certain points on the map. I carried my rifle everywhere, even to the outhouse. Then something happened that still keeps me up some nights. It was a Thursday, September 12th. Around 11:30 at night, I woke up to a metal clanging sound. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. It sounded like something striking a pipe. Not once, but in a steady rhythm. Bang, bang, bang. Then silence. Then again closer. Bang, bang, bang. I grabbed my rifle and stepped out onto the porch. The moon was out, casting long shadows through the trees. I couldn't see anything, but the sound came again. Bang, bang, bang. Then it stopped altogether. I stayed awake until morning, sitting by the window watching the tree line. I didn't hear the sound again after that night, but I started seeing things moved around outside. A pile of rocks that hadn't been there before. Tree branches laid across the trail in unnatural patterns. Once I found the cabin's water barrel tipped over, though the lid was still sealed. No signs of animals.
No claw marks.
No tracks. By late September, I filed an early request to rotate out. I told them my knee was acting up and I didn't feel confident in solo patrols anymore. They approved it. I left the mountain on October 1st. I never told them about the folders. I brought them with me, sealed in a dry bag, and buried them in my storage unit back in Cheyenne. I didn't look at them again until last year. When I pulled them out, I found something else tucked behind one of the file sleeves. It was a photo, faded, creased. It showed a man in a ranger's uniform, standing in front of that same old cabin, only when it was still standing. He looked rough, like he hadn't slept in weeks. On the back, someone had written, HK/Sector C/Fall, 1974. Never saw him again after April. I think someone wanted that whole operation forgotten. And I think I wasn't supposed to find that place. To this day, I don't go back to that part of the state. I still work in conservation, mostly in the plains now. Open land. Nothing hiding behind the trees. That cabin is probably gone now, swallowed by snow and time. But sometimes I dream of that clanging sound again. Bang, bang, bang. And I wonder if HK ever made it out. It was late October 2013 when my boss called me in and told me I was being sent up north for a solo job. My name's Tom Haley, and back then I was 34 years old, working as a full-time woodsman for a private logging outfit based in western Montana. We mostly cut contracts for fire mitigation, clearing pine and fir in dry zones before winter rolled in. Sometimes we'd do cleanup work after controlled burns. Sometimes we'd just cut and haul up logs for fencing. That job paid like crap, but I loved the woods. I liked the peace. I liked the long days, the rhythm of work, the way I could lose myself in the swing of an axe or the whine of the chainsaw. I didn't mind being alone either. I had been divorced a few years at that point, no kids, and I was the kind of guy who kept to himself mostly. My boss, Scott, handed me a folder and told me it was a small job. 10 acres of old lodgepole and aspen along the edge of state land up near the Idaho line. A guy had bought some old property and wanted the old growth cleared so he could make it usable again. I didn't ask what that meant. We get that kind of job all the time. People buy land they think they can tame, and they bring in guys like me to strip it down so they can slap a house on top. Scott gave me a week to get it done. He said the guy who owned it didn't want anyone else out there, so I'd be working solo. Normally we'd go in pairs for chainsaw safety, but Scott said it'd be fine, just an easy job. There was an old cabin on the land, one the new owner said I could use while I was there. I didn't ask many questions. It was money, it was trees, it was quiet. I loaded up my old Chevy with all the gear I needed. Gas cans, bar oil, extra chains, axe, wedges, splitter, a few tarps, my small camping stove, and a cooler with enough food to last the week. I brought my dog with me, too, Murphy. A 6-year-old black lab-eyed had since he was a pup. He always came with me on solo jobs. The drive up took most of the day. I passed through a little town called Ellisford before heading deeper into the backwoods. The last few miles were on a narrow logging road that hadn't been used in years. Ruts in the dirt and overgrowth on the edges scraped against my doors. The forest was thick up there. Tamarack, fir, pine, and big, swaying aspens turning gold in the wind. Felt like stepping back in time. The cabin came into view just before sunset. It was smaller than I expected. Single-room shack with an old porch and a rusted chimney pipe leaning at an angle. The boards were weathered to gray, windows clouded with age. The door was warped and creaked when I opened it, and the whole place smelled like old wood, ash, and rodent droppings. Still, it was dry, and the small wood stove in the corner looked usable. There was a rickety table, a cracked mirror on one wall, and a wooden cot in the corner with no mattress. I laid out my bedroll on the cot, tossed my gear in the corner, and fed Murphy a bowl of kibble while I heated up some soup on the stove. It was quiet out there, not peaceful quiet, more like the kind of silence that presses on your ears. I figured it was just because I wasn't used to that level of isolation. Even when I camped alone, I was rarely more than a few miles from the nearest forest road or service route. But this place felt cut off. The first night passed slow. I didn't sleep well. Murphy paced for a while, which was unusual for him, but he settled down by my bed eventually. I thought maybe he just didn't like the smell of the place. In the morning, I got up at first light and walked the edge of the property to mark the tree line. It was just over 9 acres, most of it on a slight slope leading up to a ridgeline where the trees grew tighter together. I spent the day clearing brush and limbing small trees near the cabin. Started up the chainsaw around 9 a.m. and kept at it till the sun started to dip. I worked slow. Solo jobs always take more time. Without a second set of eyes or ears, I had to be cautious. That's rule number 1 out there.
No mistakes.
You break a leg or drop a tree wrong when no one's around to help. Well, you might not get back out. By sunset, I had a nice little stack of rounds split and piled near the cabin. I fired up the stove with some dry aspen and cooked a little rice and beef on the skillet. Murphy was still acting strange. He sat by the door most of the evening, ears perked, eyes fixed out the window like he was listening. I opened the door a few times, but I didn't hear anything, just whined through the trees. The second night, I woke up just after midnight. No reason, just suddenly wide awake. Murphy was sitting up stiff, staring at the cabin door. His back was straight and his tail was stiff against the floor. I listened but couldn't hear anything. I got up, slipped on my boots, and stepped outside. The woods were pitch black. My flashlight barely reached 20 feet past the porch. I stood there for a while, listening. The wind had died down. There was nothing. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the sound of distant branches snapping. Just the sound of my own breath and Murphy shifting behind me. After a few minutes, I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to sleep again. I didn't. Next morning, I felt off. I thought maybe I was just sleep deprived. I had a knot in my stomach, and Murphy wouldn't leave my side. Normally when I work, he explores or naps in the sun. But that day he followed me everywhere, tree to tree, tail low, ears twitching. I got into a rhythm cutting on the 3rd day, made good progress through the upper slope. But around 3 p.m., I noticed something odd. There were boot prints up the hill from where I was working. Not mine. Too narrow, and the tread didn't match my logging boots. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. Maybe a day or 2. I followed them for a bit, up toward the tree line, but they just stopped. No sign of where the person had gone. No return prints.
No drag marks.
Just stopped near a big boulder and a rotting stump. I stood there for a while trying to make sense of it. Thought maybe the guy doubled back in his own tracks. but I couldn't find anything. I marked the spot with a flag and kept working, but I couldn't shake the unease. That night, it got worse. I was outside chopping kindling when I heard something in the trees. Not close, maybe 100 feet off. Something heavy, moving slow, not crashing but steady, deliberate. I froze. Murphy growled low and stayed pressed against my leg. I waited. The sound stopped. I called out. Nothing. I walked the tree line with my flashlight. I didn't see anything, but I felt eyes. I can't explain that part well. It's just a sense you get when you've been in the woods long enough. When something's watching you. I backed up slowly, got inside, and locked the door. All night, I barely slept. Murphy didn't either. On the fourth day, I found something I didn't expect. On the east edge of the property, near the old fence line, I saw a pile of rocks stacked in a strange formation. Not like a cairn or a survey marker, just a pile, waist-high, stacked with care. Mossy, old, but with fresh dirt around the base like someone had cleaned around it recently. I didn't touch it. I made a wide arc around it and marked a line to stay clear. That afternoon, I came back to the cabin and found the door ajar. I knew I had locked it. I double-check every time, especially on solo jobs. I stepped inside slow. Everything looked untouched. My tools were there. My bag was still zipped, but the cot had been moved a few inches. I didn't imagine it. I had lined my boots up under it earlier, and now they were crooked. I swept the cabin inside and out. Nothing. No tracks.
No prints.
No signs of forced entry, but I felt it deep in my gut. Someone had been inside. Maybe while I was working. Maybe they watched me leave. Maybe they waited. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat with my axe across my lap, my flashlight near. Murphy curled beside me, growling low every time wind hit the window. On the fifth morning, I decided I'd had enough. I packed my gear, loaded the truck, and locked up the cabin. I didn't even finish the contract. I left a note in the logbook and headed down the access road. About 2 miles down, I found a tree across the road. Fresh fall. The leaves were still green. Clean cut. Chainsawed. Someone had dropped it intentionally. I sat there for a long time, thinking. I didn't hear the saw. I was only gone from the site a few hours. Whoever did it knew I'd be coming. They timed it. They watched. I didn't try to clear it. I didn't want to get out of the truck. I backed up half a mile and took the old utility spur through the ravine. Nearly wrecked the suspension, but I made it out. I didn't tell Scott much, just said the site felt wrong. He didn't press. Maybe he knew. Maybe he'd sent other guys up there before. I never went back. That winter, I looked up the property. There was no sale record, no official transfer. The county records showed it still belonged to a guy who had died in 1996. No known heirs.
No permit requests. No logging approvals.
Nothing. I tried asking around Ellis Ford the next time I passed through. Old guy at the diner told me nobody went near that ridge anymore. Said it was bad ground. I didn't ask what that meant. I didn't want to know. It was the fall of 2021 when I decided to take a week off from everything and go up to a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Idaho. I'd found the place listed on a lesser-known site that people use for renting off-grid cabins. It was isolated, no cell service, no running water, no neighbors within 10 miles. That was exactly what I needed. After my job started draining me and things in my personal life got more complicated, I needed the kind of peace that only comes with silence and trees. I brought my dog, Chase. He's a 6-year-old black Labrador, a loyal hiking partner and alert enough to always sense when something feels off. I trust him more than I trust most people. He's never let me down, and in the woods, I counted on his ears and nose more than anything else. The drive out took longer than expected. The last stretch of road wasn't even paved, just a winding dirt path that twisted through thick pine trees and brush. I followed the directions I'd printed off, relying on paper maps and landmarks since I lost signal about 30 minutes before getting there. The road grew narrow and rough. At one point, I had to stop and move a fallen branch. By the time I reached the small wooden cabin nestled in a clearing, it was almost evening. The sky was already turning that orange-gray color that tells you night's coming. The cabin was older but sturdy, made of thick logs with a tin roof. There was a single room with a wood stove in one corner, a cot, a small table with a couple chairs, and some shelves stocked with old canned food and bottled water. No electricity.
No luxuries.
Just a place to exist quietly. There was a rain barrel out back for water, and a dry outhouse about 50 feet into the trees. After unloading the truck and feeding Chase, I sat out front and watched the sun dip below the trees. The cold crept in fast, but the silence was exactly what I came for. Chase lay by my feet, calm but alert. He always stayed close to me the first night in a new place. That first night was uneventful. I lit a few candles, stoked a small fire in the wood stove, and read from an old book I'd brought. Chase curled up near the door, not sleeping deeply, just watching. I could hear the wind move through the trees and an occasional snapping twig, but nothing out of the ordinary. The second day I spent exploring the woods nearby. I marked the trail behind the cabin with small piles of rocks and snapped branches so I wouldn't get lost. Chase moved ahead of me, sniffing everything. He chased a few squirrels and once paused and stared into the trees for a long while, ears stiff, body still. I waited with him, hand on my knife, but whatever he sensed either moved off or wasn't a threat. He relaxed and we kept going. I found an old trail, almost overgrown, that seemed to head further north. I followed it for maybe half a mile before deciding to turn back. Something about it felt strange. Not dangerous, just forgotten. The path was uneven, and there were fallen branches and signs that no one had walked there in years. That night, something woke me. Chase growled low, the kind of growl he makes when he doesn't know if something's a threat yet. I sat up and listened. The woods outside were quiet, almost too quiet. No wind, no insects, no owls. Just silence. Chase stood and walked to the door, his ears forward, sniffing the air under the crack. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly stepped over to him. I didn't open the door. I listened first, flashlight off. I could hear something, a soft crunch, like footsteps through dry leaves. Not fast, slow, measured. I clicked on the flashlight and opened the door a crack, just enough to shine the beam outside. Nothing. The trees stood motionless. I waited, watching. Chase didn't bark, but he didn't stop growling either. I closed the door again and double-checked the latch. Whoever or whatever was out there didn't come closer. After about 15 minutes, Chase settled back down and I finally managed to fall asleep again. By the third day, I'd gotten comfortable. I chopped some firewood, went on another hike, and even cooked a basic meal using an old camping stove I brought. Chase seemed relaxed again, though occasionally he would pause mid-walk and look toward the woods. I'd gotten used to that behavior over the years. Sometimes animals caught scents we couldn't smell or sounds we didn't hear. That evening, just before sunset, I decided to follow the overgrown trail further. I figured if I stayed alert and didn't go too far, I'd be fine. Chase was hesitant at first, but followed me. The trail narrowed quickly. The air grew cooler, damper. I noticed things were different here. Less undergrowth, fewer signs of animals, no birdsong. The trees were thick and old. Some looked twisted, not in any unnatural way, just shaped by wind and time. About a mile in, we came across something strange. It was a clearing, circular, with rocks laid out in a pattern. Not a fire pit or anything that obvious. Just small flat stones, maybe 30 of them, arranged like a broken ring. At the center was what looked like the remains of a wooden post, maybe part of a sign or old fence. Whatever it was, it had been there a long time. It was gray and splintered. I looked around, noting how the trail seemed to fade completely here. Chase didn't like it. His ears were back, tail low. He sniffed the ground, then backed away. I stood there a few minutes, then decided it was enough. The sun was getting low, and I didn't want to get stuck out there after dark. On the way back, I kept feeling like something was behind us. Not close, but just out of sight. Chase kept glancing over his shoulder too, staying tighter to my side than usual. That night, something came closer. It was around 2 a.m. when Chase started barking. Not growling.
Barking, loud, sharp, rapid.
I jumped out of bed, heart hammering, and grabbed the flashlight. He was at the door again, fur raised, barking his head off. I shushed him and listened. Footsteps, heavy ones. Someone was moving around just outside the cabin, slow and steady. I opened the door fast and shone the light into the trees. I caught a glimpse of movement. Someone walking upright, wearing dark clothes, maybe a hood. But the second the light hit them, they stepped behind a tree and disappeared into the woods. I shouted, even though I didn't expect a reply. I scanned the trees for several minutes, but saw nothing else. I stayed up the rest of the night, flashlight in one hand, a hatchet in the other. Chase stayed right next to me, growling every so often, but no more sounds came. In the morning, I went outside and looked for tracks. There were footprints, real human ones. Big boots, maybe size 12 or 13. They came up from the tree behind the cabin and stopped maybe 10 feet from the door, then backed away. I followed them for a while, but they vanished into the woods quickly. The ground was hard and dry, and tracking beyond the clearing was impossible. I considered packing up and leaving, but I told myself it could have been a hunter or a hiker. Still, the direction those prints came from, it was toward that overgrown trail, toward the clearing, and there hadn't been any vehicle tracks when I first drove in. That stuck with me. I spent most of that day on edge, barely leaving the cabin. I kept a small fire going and moved my truck closer to the front in case I had to leave fast. Chase wouldn't relax. Every noise outside made him sit up, ears perked. He didn't bark again, but he didn't rest either. That night, it rained, hard. Wind shook the trees, and the cabin creaked constantly. Around midnight, Chase growled again. I sat up fast, flashlight ready. I didn't hear anything at first, just the rain. Then a dull sound, metal on wood, like something brushing or tapping against the side of the cabin. I stood up and crept to the front window. I didn't shine the light yet. I saw a figure, just standing at the edge of the clearing, watching the cabin. I couldn't make out details, just a tall, unmoving shape. It didn't move when the rain hit it, just stood there. I waited. After a while, it turned and walked back into the trees, slowly, like it wasn't in any hurry at all. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Chase stayed awake too. The next morning, I found more prints, same size boots, but this time they circled the cabin. Someone had walked all the way around while I was inside. I saw where the prints went behind the rain barrel and even passed by the outhouse. No vehicle tracks, just those same boots. I made the call then. I was leaving. I packed everything into the truck, grabbed Chase, and started the engine. I didn't even care that the rental was for 2 more nights. I just needed to get back to the main road. About 5 miles down the dirt path, I saw something that froze my blood. In the middle of the road was a dead rabbit. Not roadkill placed there. Clean, not crushed. It looked like it had been laid out purposefully. Next to it was a piece of wood, about the length of a ruler, with one end sharpened like a stake. I stopped the truck, stared at it for a long moment, then slowly drove around it. I didn't stop again until I reached the first town an hour later. I got a hotel for the night and let Chase sleep on the bed next to me. Neither of us really slept. I kept thinking about that figure in the woods, the tracks, the clearing with the stones. I never reported it. I didn't know what I'd even say. No crime was committed. No one was hurt. But I never went back to that area again. I don't even like camping anymore. Not the way I used to. Something was out there. Someone. Watching, waiting, walking circles around my cabin while I slept. And the worst part? They knew I was there the whole time. They just chose not to come in. My name's Carter. I'm 42 years old, divorced, no kids. I've worked for the state of Idaho's forestry department for almost 15 years, mostly doing land assessments, fire inspections, and the occasional backwoods structural check. It's not glamorous work, but I've always liked the quiet, being alone out in nature with nothing but trees and sky to look at. It's the one thing that's kept me grounded through all the personal messes I've had over the years. This happened back in late October of 2021. I remember the date clearly because it was just before hunting season began, and we were rushing through a backlog of safety checks for old leased cabins on state land. One cabin in particular had been flagged because its lease hadn't been renewed in over a decade. A new buyer had shown interest in purchasing the lease and reactivating it, so the state wanted a full inspection done before any paperwork was signed. The cabin sat miles deep in Clearwater National Forest, about 3 hours northeast of Lewiston, near a part of the woods that's rarely visited except by backcountry hunters. I was assigned the task of driving out, hiking in, and spending 2 days inspecting the structure, logging the condition of the cabin, checking the nearby trail access, water source, and taking inventory of any leftover materials or tools the previous occupant might have left behind. Pretty straightforward stuff. I packed up the state-issued Jeep with food, my inspection gear, a first aid kit, a basic toolkit, extra gas, and my sleeping bag. Since I'd be spending the night, I threw in my old Winchester rifle just in case I ran into a bear. I don't like to carry weapons normally, but out there in the backcountry, it's better to be safe than sorry. I left Lewiston early in the morning, around 5:30. It was still dark. A cold rain had rolled in the night before, so the roads were slick and the sky was gray as hell. After 2 hours of driving north on Highway 12, I turned off onto a barely marked dirt road that wound deep into the forest. There were no signs. The GPS didn't even register it as a road, just a trail. I drove slowly, tires slipping a bit in the mud, windshield wipers squeaking across the glass. Trees lined both sides, thick pines and firs, and the deeper I went, the less light filtered through the branches. After about 45 minutes of crawling along, I reached the end of the drivable path. There was an old wooden post with a faded yellow sign nailed to it. Cabin 6, ID State Land, restricted entry. I parked the Jeep off the trail and gathered my gear. The hike from there was about 4 miles, mostly uphill. I locked the Jeep, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started walking. The trail was narrow, partly overgrown, and littered with slick roots and wet pine needles. A few times I had to stop and use my GPS to double-check I was heading the right way. There were no markers, no cairns, no recent boot tracks. Felt like no one had been out there in years. I reached the cabin just after noon. It was smaller than I expected. A single-story wood structure with a tin roof, slightly rusted at the corners. The logs that made up the walls were weather-beaten, but still solid. There was a small porch out front, though one of the support beams had cracked near the base, making the whole thing sag to one side. The front door was closed but not locked. No sign of forced entry. I did a quick walk around. The back of the cabin had an old metal chimney pipe that looked clogged with soot and rust. The small outhouse 20 feet away had partially collapsed, probably from snow load or wind. The water source, a natural spring down a short path, was still flowing clear and cold. Everything about the place seemed forgotten. like time had stopped here 10 years ago and nothing had touched it since. I dropped my pack on the porch and took out my inspection notebook. First, I jotted down basic structural notes, then stepped inside. The cabin smelled like dry rot and dust. It was one room, a cot in the back with a moth-eaten blanket, a small metal stove, a workbench, and a wooden table with 2 chairs. Some canned food still sat on a shelf near the window. Most of it expired. There were a few old tools hanging on nails.
O roistidex, o honchv, o lantern.
Everything had a thin coat of dust on it, like no one had touched anything in years. That's when I noticed something strange. There was a second chair, pushed out from the table just slightly. Not much, maybe 6 inches, but it looked deliberate, like someone had been sitting there not too long ago. I bent down and checked the floor beneath it. The dust pattern was off, like a boot had scuffed the wood and stirred up the surface. It wasn't much, but it was enough to put me on alert. I took a deep breath and kept moving. There was no sign of recent occupation otherwise. No food wrappers, no water bottles, no new footprints. I checked every corner, even the tiny loft area up above the entrance. Nothing. I spent the rest of the day doing my full inspection. I checked the integrity of the walls, the chimney, the window seals, the floorboards. I documented the damage to the porch and outhouse. I logged everything on my phone and took dozens of photos. By the time I was done, it was almost dark. I boiled some water on the stove using my own gear and ate a freeze-dried meal. I set up my sleeping bag on the cot, made sure the door was latched, and propped my rifle near the bed just in case. I didn't sleep well. Every creak and groan of the wind outside put me on edge. At one point during the night, I thought I heard something, or someone, walk across the porch, just 2 or 3 steps, then nothing. I sat up in the dark for over an hour, holding my breath, staring at the door, rifle in hand. Eventually, I must have nodded off, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. I made coffee, packed my gear, and went to do one last sweep of the area before heading back. That's when I found it. Behind the cabin, about 40 yards into the woods, there was an old tool shed. I hadn't seen it the day before, maybe because of the light or the trees. It was almost completely hidden in brush. The door had a padlock on it, rusted shut. I used my hammer and pried it open, thinking maybe I'd find some extra tools or scrap to inventory. Instead, I found something I wasn't prepared for. Inside the shed, along the back wall, were crates. 4 of them, all made from rough pine boards nailed shut. I opened the one on top. Inside were dozens of Polaroid photographs, stacked in plastic sleeves. They were old but well preserved. I picked one up. It showed a man, possibly in his 30s, kneeling beside a deer he'd shot. Normal enough. I flipped through more, but the deeper I went into the stack, the stranger they became. There were photos of the same man, but this time watching people. Hikers, it looked like. Hunters. People walking on trails or sitting by fires. None of them seemed to know they were being photographed. The angles were always distant, from trees, behind brush. Dozens of them. I kept flipping through. Eventually, the photos changed again. Now the images were closer. The people looked startled, confused. Some seemed like they were trying to run. The final few in that crate showed blood. One showed someone lying in the dirt, unmoving, their face turned away. I stood there in the cold, hands shaking, heart racing. I didn't want to open the other crates, but I did. One was filled with clothing, all different sizes, jackets, shirts, hats, all faded, damp, and folded in piles. Another had knives, dozens of them, hunting blades, pocket knives, old machetes, all sharpened, clean. Some looked brand new. The last crate was empty except for one thing, a leather-bound notebook. Inside the notebook were pages and pages of notes, written in tight, shaky handwriting. Dates, Times, trails, names, and strange phrases like, "They never saw me," and "took them by the spring," and "dragged the body before the snow." I read maybe 10 pages before I had to stop. It was too much. I left everything as I found it and backed out of the shed. I hiked out of there in under 2 hours, practically jogging most of the way. I didn't stop to eat or drink. When I reached the Jeep, I threw my pack in, locked the doors, and drove straight back to Lewiston without stopping. I filed my report that night, but I left out the shed. Instead, I contacted a friend of mine in law enforcement, a retired fish and game officer named Donnelly. I told him everything. He came by my place, listened to the whole story, and promised to pass it to the right people. I don't know what happened after that. I never heard a word from the forestry department. No follow-up, no new inspection. A few months later, I checked the lease registry out of curiosity. That cabin had been permanently removed from the available lease list. It was listed as closed for environmental reasons. I never got an explanation. I never went back. But every now and then, I still think about those photos. Those names in the notebook. The man in the pictures, his face smiling, half hidden by a cap, always in the distance, watching. And I wonder how many people over the years passed by that same cabin, not knowing someone was there in the trees watching them too. It was late October of 2018 when I decided to take a break from everything. I had just turned 33. My job in Glasgow had been eating away at me for years. I worked in a small security firm doing overnight patrols and camera monitoring. It wasn't exciting, but it paid my rent. After years of night shifts, I needed to breathe again. I hadn't been hunting in nearly 5 years, and I missed it. I grew up in northern Scotland, and hunting with my uncle was a big part of my life when I was younger. My uncle, Tom, had passed away a few years back, and I hadn't been to his hunting cabin since. It was deep in the Cairngorms, at least 4 miles off any main road, tucked away near a barely used forest path. I remembered it as a quiet, cold little place with no electricity, no signal, no running water. Just 4 walls, a wood stove, an old bunk, and memories. My uncle used to bring me there when I was a teenager, and we'd spend entire weekends stalking deer, trapping rabbits, and listening to the wind howl through the trees. I took a week off work, told my boss I needed time, packed light but carefully. A bolt-action .308 rifle, 2 boxes of ammo, a compass, a few freeze-dried meals, plenty of bottled water, a first aid kit, a portable stove, a tarp, and a good sleeping bag. I also packed a small hatchet and my uncle's old hunting knife, which I hadn't touched since the funeral. It took me almost half a day to hike out there. The trail had grown over. I had to cut through brambles, hop over rotting logs, and follow deer trails to get close to the cabin. I didn't recognize the land like I thought I would. I got turned around a few times. The weather was calm but gray, with low clouds that never lifted. When I finally reached the cabin, it didn't look like how I remembered it. It looked smaller, more tired. The logs were cracked in places. The door creaked. Some of the windows were fogged over or coated in old dust. I expected that. What I didn't expect was the quiet. No birds, no insects, no wind. Just that still, empty quiet that you can only hear when something feels off. Still, I chalked it up to nerves. I hadn't been this far into the woods in years. My boots were soaked. My shoulders ached from the weight of my gear, and I just wanted to sit. I unlocked the cabin with the old key I had kept on my keychain since Tom passed. It still worked. Inside, it smelled like old smoke, dust, and dry rot. The wooden floor creaked under my feet. There were still a few of my uncle's things left. His tin coffee pot, an old lantern, a pile of moth-eaten blankets, some tools on the wall. It looked like no one had touched the place since he last left. That gave me some comfort. I dropped my pack and sat down for a while. The silence made everything louder. Every crack of the wood, every shift of the wind against the logs. I lit the wood stove using a bit of dry pine I had brought in with me. Took a while to catch, but soon the cabin warmed slightly. I unpacked and got comfortable. I was alone and I liked it, or I told myself I did. That night was colder than I expected. I lay in my sleeping bag, fully clothed, and still felt the chill creeping in. The woods outside were pitch black. I kept the rifle next to me on the floor, just like my uncle used to do. I didn't sleep well. Every few minutes, I'd hear a pop in the wood, or what sounded like a scrape outside. Probably branches in the wind or animals moving through the brush. But something about it got under my skin. I kept checking the small window beside the bunk, but I couldn't see anything. I finally fell asleep around 3 a.m. When I woke up the next morning, I made tea over the stove, ate a cold protein bar, and got ready to head out for the day. I strapped the rifle across my back and walked out into the mist. The air was sharp and wet, and the woods were quiet again. Not in a peaceful way, more like the forest was waiting. I followed a game trail about a mile east, looking for signs. Found a few prints that looked fresh. Could have been red deer. I tracked them into a narrow ravine but lost them near a creek. Around noon, I found a good overlook and sat for an hour or two, just listening. Nothing. No birds, no rustling. Even the creek sounded muffled. Around 3 p.m., I started heading back. As I approached the cabin, something strange caught my eye. There were fresh footprints. Not mine. I checked carefully. These were boot prints larger than mine with a slightly different tread. They led from the tree lean to the side of the cabin, near the woodpile. I froze, looked around. No one. I checked the door. Still locked. Windows intact. Nothing inside looked touched, but the tracks were real. Someone had been walking around the cabin while I was out. I felt a strange tightness in my chest, like someone had been watching. Maybe a hiker, I told myself. Maybe someone lost. But they didn't knock. They didn't leave a note. They didn't try to get help. That night, I kept the rifle even closer. I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking I heard something walking around outside. Slow steps, a crunch, then nothing. Then again, closer to the window. I sat up, waited, held my breath. But there was never anything when I looked. By morning, I felt hungover from lack of sleep. I stepped out carefully, scanning the woods. Nothing moved. I circled the cabin. The tracks were still there, and now there were more. They were circling the cabin. Someone had walked around it twice, maybe 3 times. I was done playing games. I packed my gear fast, thinking about heading back to the road. But part of me didn't want to seem scared. I kept telling myself I was overreacting. People hike out here sometimes. Maybe someone saw smoke and got curious. Still, I walked with my rifle ready that day. I didn't go far. I stayed within sight of the cabin and watched the woods more than I hunted. I saw nothing, not even a squirrel. It felt like the whole forest had been emptied out. I sat under a tree and tried to calm down. Told myself if anything felt wrong that night, I'd leave first thing in the morning. When I got back to the cabin before dark, I found something that made my stomach turn. One of the windows had been scratched. Not broken, just scratched. 4 or 5 long, deep marks down the outside glass, like someone had dragged a blade across it. Not a branch. These were straight, clean lines, purposeful. I stepped inside slowly, checked every corner, every shadow. Nothing. But my breathing was short, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I shoved a chair under the door handle and blocked the windows with the tarp from my bag. I made no fire that night. I sat in the dark, listening. Around midnight, I heard something move on the porch. Not footsteps, a shift of weight, wood creaking, like someone was standing there, waiting. I didn't move. Then scraping. against the wall, slow, steady, like someone dragging something metal along the logs. I aimed the rifle toward the door and waited. My heart was pounding so loud I thought they'd hear it. I waited for something, anything, to happen, but nothing did. By dawn, I was still sitting there, exhausted and frozen. The sounds had stopped sometime around 3 a.m. I didn't open the door until the sun was fully up. When I did, I found the marks again, this time deeper, across the wood next to the door, for deep grooves just like the ones on the glass. I didn't pack. I didn't eat. I left immediately, rifle in hand, gear strapped down loose. I didn't care. I just wanted out. The hike back felt twice as long. I kept checking behind me. At one point, I swear I saw someone far off the trail. A figure, still, watching. I blinked, and it was gone. Could have been a tree. Could have been my nerves. I didn't stop to check. By late afternoon, I reached the road and flagged down a car. Didn't care who it was. Just needed to get back. I never told anyone the full story. Just said I heard strange noises and got spooked. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. A few weeks later, I got a call from my cousin who sometimes hunts in that area. He told me a man had been arrested a few miles from the cabin. He had been squatting in different abandoned hunting cabins for years, living off stolen supplies. The police found knives, wire, rope, and a journal with drawings and notes, scribbles about people he watched, cabin numbers, times, days. My uncle's cabin was mentioned more than once. I never went back, and I never will. I was 31 when I decided to take a break from everything and spend a few days alone in a cabin I found online. It was early October of 2019, a few weeks before the heavy snow started up north. I lived in Denver at the time, but I wanted to get as far away from the city as I could. I'd been dealing with some personal crap, burnout from work, a breakup a few months earlier, and just feeling disconnected in general. I was tired of screens, tired of traffic, tired of fake smiles and short conversations. I found the cabin through a small listing site for backcountry rentals. It wasn't on Airbnb or anything like that. The ad didn't even have a phone number, just an email. A guy named Jim replied, short and to the point. The cabin was about 3 hours northwest, near a place called Walden, not too far from the Wyoming border. It sat on 30 acres of private land, and he said no one would be around. The photos showed a small wooden place, basic inside but clean, with stove, bed, propane lanterns, no electricity, no plumbing, just a compost toilet outside. Exactly what I was looking for. I packed my car with enough food and water for 5 days, a couple of warm sleeping bags, a solar power bank, and my .22 rifle. I didn't plan on hunting, but I always brought it on trips like this, mostly for varmints, just in case. I printed out directions since cell signal would be gone long before I got there. The drive up was peaceful. I stopped for gas in a small town halfway there, then kept going through miles of empty forest roads. The last few miles were rough, nothing but gravel and muddy tire ruts, but I finally found the small hand-painted sign on a tree marking the turnoff. From there, it was another 15-minute crawl down a narrow, tree-covered path that barely looked like a road. When I finally saw the cabin, it felt like I had landed on another planet. It was tucked in at the base of a low ridge, surrounded by trees on 3 sides and open meadow on the 4th. A small creek ran down behind it. The roof was steel and rusted at the edges, and the wood siding looked faded and dark from years of sun and snow. But it felt solid. No garbage, no graffiti, no sign of anyone else. Just the wind, the quiet, and the faint smell of pine. The first day was uneventful. I unpacked, settled in, lit the little wood stove inside, and made some instant soup. I sat on the porch with a thermos of hot tea and watched the sun go down behind the ridge. I didn't check my phone once. It was dead, and I didn't care. I read a few chapters of a book, then turned in early. The first night was quiet except for some small animal noises. Mice maybe, or something walking around outside. That's normal in the woods. The cabin creaked a little as it cooled down, but I was used to that. I slept pretty well, all things considered. The second day I explored a bit. There were no marked trails, but I followed the creek for about a mile until it turned rocky and steep. I didn't see any cabins or signs of people, just deer prints, squirrels, and once, a flash of what I think was a fox. I took photos on my small camera, sat in the sun for a while, and made my way back. That night is when I started noticing small things that didn't sit right. First, the cabin door. I always latched it from the inside. There was no lock, just a metal hook that kept it shut. In the morning, I woke up and found it slightly ajar. Not open, just unlatched. I was groggy and told myself maybe I forgot to hook it properly. I double-checked everything the next night. Latched the door tight, made sure the windows were shut, rifle next to the bed. That night, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't an animal. It was the unmistakable crunch of boots on dried leaves. Slow, deliberate steps outside the cabin. I held my breath and listened. They moved around the back, then stopped. I couldn't see anything from inside. There were no windows on the back wall, just the front and sides. I waited maybe 20 minutes before I heard them move again, slowly walking back around the side and toward the front, then silence. I didn't move. I just lay there, heart thudding, waiting for something, anything to happen. Nothing did. When the sun finally rose, I went outside.
No footprints.
The ground was covered in old leaves and pine needles, dry enough to make noise but not soft enough to hold a print. Still, I knew what I heard. I thought maybe it was a hunter, someone trespassing without realizing the land was private. I told myself that, but it felt wrong. There was no reason for anyone to be out there at night, walking slow circles around a remote cabin with no lights. I didn't sleep well that night or the one after. I didn't hear the steps again, but I kept thinking about them. I stayed inside most of the day, kept my rifle close, and started feeling that sick mix of boredom and anxiety. Time moved slow. I counted the hours. On the fourth day, I hiked a little farther out to try and clear my head. About 2 miles up the ridge, I found something strange. There was an old fire ring, just some blackened rocks and charred sticks, but it was recent, within the last week at least, and near it a pile of bones. Not human, but definitely not from a deer or elk. Looked like raccoon maybe, or something smaller. Picked clean, no fur. Arranged neatly in a small circle. I took a photo, stared at it for a while and turned back. Something was off about the way the bones were placed. Like it wasn't natural. Like someone had done it on purpose. Back at the cabin, I found something else. A nail. Just one, but it hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. It was on the small table by the window, a big rusty iron nail like the kind you'd find in old barns. I hadn't brought it. I hadn't seen it before, and I hadn't left the cabin unlocked. I searched the whole cabin again, under the bed, in the small pantry behind the stove. Nothing else was missing or out of place, but that nail stuck with me. I picked it up, wrapped it in paper, and put it in my pack. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside made my heart race. I didn't hear the footsteps again, but I thought I saw something. Just a flicker. Passed by the window once. Could have been a tree branch. Could have been my mind playing tricks.
I steiet a vacke till dawn.
On the fifth morning, I decided to pack up early. I had one more night booked, but I was done. I wasn't scared exactly, I was just uneasy, like I'd pushed my luck already. I loaded the car slowly, double-checked everything, and gave the place one last look. As I pulled out and drove down the narrow track, I stopped once to check the map. While standing next to my car, I noticed something in the trees about 40 yards away, a flash of blue. I squinted. It was a tarp, just a corner of it, half buried under leaves and branches. I walked toward it, careful, my boots crunching softly. It was a small tent, old, moldy, collapsed on one side, probably a two-person tent, faded blue and gray. No one was inside, but it looked like it had been lived in not long ago. There was a pile of empty cans nearby, and some tattered clothes strung on a low branch.
No bags.
No ID, just trash and quiet. But the strangest thing was the wall behind the tent. It wasn't a wall exactly, more like a flat piece of plywood, propped up by stakes. And on it were dozens of nails. Long, old, rusty nails driven into the wood in neat rows. Some were bent, some were clean, some had dark stains near the tips. Next to the plywood, almost buried under the dirt, was a small metal box. I opened it. Inside were photos, printed ones like from an old film camera. Dozens of them. Cabin windows, trees, deer. Some were just dark or blurry, but others were of people. Men, women, all alone in the woods. Some looking right into the camera mid-step. One of them, my stomach dropped, was of me, sitting on the porch of the cabin, reading my book. I hadn't heard a sound. I dropped the box and ran. I didn't care about the tent or the plywood or the rest of it. I got in the car and drove as fast as I could without blowing a tire on those awful roads. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. I didn't look back. I called the sheriff's office from a gas station an hour later and told them everything. I gave them the coordinates, the photos, the tent, the nail. They said they'd send someone out. They never called me back. I tried to follow up once, but they brushed me off. Said it was probably an old squatter camp, that nothing illegal had been found, that the landowner, Jim, hadn't seen anything unusual. Maybe he hadn't, maybe he had. I didn't care. I never went back. I don't camp alone anymore. I don't rent remote cabins. And I never assume I'm the only one out there, because I know now I wasn't. It was late September 2018. I was 33 at the time, living in Springfield, Illinois, and working as a mechanic in a local repair shop. Things were quiet that year. I had just gone through a breakup that left me drained and kind of numb. I wasn't looking to be around people for a while. I needed a break from the noise of the town, the endless texts from people trying to cheer me up, the small talk at work. I just wanted to disappear somewhere and be alone. A guy I worked with named Travis mentioned his cousin had a piece of land with a small hunting cabin out near Mason County. Not a modern cabin either, no Wi-Fi, no cell service, barely a working generator. It sat out near an old cornfield that hadn't been touched in years. The place was empty most of the time. He said if I wanted peace and quiet, that was the spot. I drove out there on a Friday morning in my old red pickup. The GPS gave up on me about 10 minutes after I left the paved road. The last stretch of the drive was just a gravel trail flanked by dry brush and old wire fences. The land was flat and open, yellow and brown, the way it gets when the harvest is past due. No other buildings for miles, just open sky, some twisted trees, and this one beaten-up wooden cabin that sat crooked on the far end of the field. The cabin was nothing fancy, a rectangle of weathered wood with a front porch that leaned slightly to the left. 2 steps led up to a door that stuck a little when I tried to open it. Inside it smelled like dust and dried mud. There was a single cot in the corner with a thin mattress and an old quilt on it. The floor creaked everywhere I stepped. The tiny kitchen had a propane stove, a few rusted pans, and one plastic chair by a table that looked like it had survived a fire. There was no bathroom, just a shovel and a designated spot behind a cluster of trees out back. I unpacked what I brought: canned food, bottled water, a lantern, a hunting knife, and a heavy flashlight. I also brought a journal, thinking maybe I'd get some thoughts out of my head by writing. I wasn't planning to hunt or do anything really. Just sit, walk around, maybe clear my head. The first night was quiet. Too quiet, really. The kind of quiet that feels heavy. I hadn't realized how loud my normal life was until I was away from it. No engines, no sirens, no phones buzzing. Just the sound of wind pushing through dry corn stalks and the occasional rustling from some small animal outside. I had trouble sleeping that night. The cot was lumpy, and every little sound outside had my ears straining. Around 2 in the morning, I swore I heard something dragging through the field. Not fast, not loud, just slow, steady movement. I sat up and held my breath. Stopped after a while, and I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon. I laid back down, but I didn't fall asleep until the sky started turning gray. The next morning, I walked the edge of the cornfield. The stalks were tall, dry, and mostly dead. They made a strange sound in the wind, like thin fingers brushing against one another. I didn't go into the field. There wasn't a real reason, I just didn't like how tall and thick it was. I couldn't see more than a few feet in. It felt like stepping into that field meant giving up sight, like letting it close around you. So I stayed along the edge. There was a rusted old scarecrow out there too, about 50 yards from the cabin. It was barely standing. Just 2 wooden posts tied together with wire, an old flannel shirt hanging from it, and a burlap sack for a head. I remember thinking it looked more like a warning than a scarecrow, like something you'd see in a movie before the characters do something stupid. The day went by slow. I read a bit, walked around the land, tried writing but didn't feel like it. I ate cold chili from a can and went to bed early, hoping to actually get some sleep. That second night was different. I woke up at some point deep in the night. I didn't hear anything at first, but I had that feeling, like something had changed. The kind of feeling that jerks you out of sleep even if everything around you seems quiet. I sat up and grabbed the flashlight. I waited, then I heard it. Something was walking on the porch. Not fast. Slow, deliberate steps. The wood creaked once, then again, then stopped. I sat frozen, light in my hand, barely breathing. A long minute passed. Then the doorknob rattled. Just once. Like someone tried it, found it locked, and then left it alone. I stood up slowly and moved to the door, staying to the side in case someone tried to kick it in or something. I waited, listened. Nothing. I counted to 100 in my head. Still nothing. I opened the door just a crack and shined the flashlight out. The porch was empty. So was the yard. I swept the light across the cornfield. Nothing moved, but that heavy, suffocating quiet was there again. My ears were ringing from it. I closed the door and pushed the chair under the knob just in case. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next morning, I walked the area around the cabin again. The ground was dry and hard, but I found a single mark in the dirt just below the porch steps. Partial boot print. Not mine, it was too narrow and had a different pattern. I didn't know what to think. Maybe some old local had wandered through. Maybe someone knew this place and figured it was still abandoned. Still, something felt off. Later that afternoon, I tried walking through the cornfield a bit. Just a short distance, maybe 10 or 15 feet in. I kept turning around to make sure I still saw the cabin. The stalks were brittle and made a soft, crunching sound underfoot. It smelled musty and rotten in there, like mildew and old hay. I didn't like it. It felt like walking into a maze with no guarantee of getting out. I backed out and sat on the porch for a while, staring out at the field. That's when I saw the scarecrow. It had moved. It was closer than before, maybe 20 feet closer to the cabin than it had been the day before. I didn't believe it at first. I thought maybe I remembered wrong, but I stared at the dirt where it used to stand. I could still see the old post hole. I got up and walked out to it. Sure enough, the ground around it was disturbed. There were drag marks in the dirt like someone had pulled it along, but there were no footprints, just long, uneven scrapes leading from the old hole to the new spot. I didn't move it. I just went back inside and locked the door. I stayed awake most of that night. I kept the flashlight in my hand and sat by the small window that looked out at the front yard. I kept checking the scarecrow every hour or so. It didn't move again. Not that I could tell. But I didn't sleep either. The next morning, I packed my bag. I planned to leave after breakfast. I didn't care about finishing the weekend. I'd had enough of peace and quiet. I wanted out. But when I walked out to the truck, I saw the tires. All 4 slashed. Clean, straight cuts. Not something from driving on a bad road. Someone had done it on purpose. That's when the fear really set in. I looked around slowly, trying not to show panic. My heart was hammering, and I felt exposed standing out in the open. I walked the area again. No one in sight. No cars. No signs of anything. Just miles of dry land, a cabin, and the cornfield. I spent most of the day inside with the shotgun I found under the cot. I didn't want to fire it unless I had to. It was old and I wasn't sure it'd work, but holding it made me feel a little less helpless. That night, the footsteps came back, but not on the porch. This time, they were around the cabin, circling it, slowly, over and over, creaking floorboards, crunching dirt. Then something heavy hit the wall near the cot. Not hard, just a dull, soft thump. I didn't move. I just sat in the corner with the shotgun, flashlight pointed at the door. Another hour passed, then silence again. At dawn, I crept outside. The scarecrow was gone. I found it later, half buried in the cornfield. The shirt torn open, the wooden arms snapped. And near it, finally, I found more prints. Boot prints. Same narrow ones. But this time, a second set too. Smaller. Barefoot. That was the last straw. I didn't care if I had to walk 20 miles. I was getting out. I took my bag, the flashlight, and the shotgun and started walking. I followed the gravel trail until I got back to where I had GPS earlier. Signal came in after an hour and a half. I called a tow company. I didn't go back to the cabin. I didn't even give directions. I just left the truck. Let them figure it out. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what their reason was. Maybe it was just some twisted local who didn't like strangers. Maybe more than one person. The way the scarecrow moved, the prints, the sound of dragging at night. It was all too strange to explain, but not magical. Just human. Someone watching, playing games. I never went back. Travis asked if I liked the cabin. I just told him it wasn't for me. That was the end of it. But sometimes, when I hear wind move through trees in the middle of the night, I think about those footsteps outside my window, and I remember that feeling, that someone was waiting just beyond the corn, and they weren't done yet. I was 35 the summer I spent 3 nights alone in a rundown cabin near Shiprock, New Mexico. I remember the exact date because it was right after my younger brother Josh had moved back to Virginia, and I'd been helping him load his stuff for a week straight. My hands were blistered from carrying furniture, and my back was killing me from all the heavy lifting. That trip wasn't supposed to be anything special. I just wanted to unplug from everything for a few days. The cabin belonged to a friend of my dad's, an old coworker from his trucking days named Marvin. I only met the guy once years back. He didn't live in it anymore. He just used it to store some hunting gear and old junk. It sat about 15 miles off the main road, tucked deep into some red rock country near the Four Corners area, not too far from a Navajo reservation, if I remember right. Marvin said I could use the place whenever I wanted. Just had to let him know so he could make sure nobody else was up there. I called him, told him I'd be heading out there Friday morning and staying until Monday. He gave me the usual rundown, Watch out for rattlesnakes. Bring my own water, and don't expect cell service. I was looking forward to it. I wanted silence. No phones. No traffic. Just time to be alone, breathe, and maybe read a book or two. I left early, around 6 a.m. It was already hot. I had my camping gear packed in the back of my truck. I brought a small cooler with food, a lantern, batteries, a tarp, and a folding chair. I also brought my .45 in the glove box just in case. Not that I expected trouble, but being out that far from town, you never really know. Took me 4 hours to get there. The last 30 minutes were the roughest. Dirt roads, sharp rocks, and thick patches of dry brush scraped along the sides of the truck. By the time I reached the cabin, dust had coated every inch of my windshield. The place looked even smaller than I remembered. Just one little structure with a front porch sagging in the middle and a roof patched with old sheet metal. No other houses in sight, just open desert and low hills all around. Inside, it smelled like dust and dry wood, cobwebs in the corners, a few old chairs, a rusty bed frame, and a tiny stove that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. I swept the floor out with an old broom I found leaning behind the door and opened a few windows to let the heat escape. I set up my sleeping bag on a mat in the corner and unpacked the cooler. The first night was quiet, still, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring a little. I sat outside as the sun dipped below the hills, watching the light fade. Coyotes yipped somewhere in the distance. I saw a few lizards dart across the sand near the porch, but nothing else. I read until it got too dark to see the pages. Then I went inside, locked the door, and laid down. I woke up once around 2 a.m. because something thumped against the outside wall. Not hard, just one thump, like a branch falling or maybe an animal brushing past. I listened for a while, but it didn't happen again, so I went back to sleep. The second day was hotter, the kind of dry heat that makes your skin feel like it's shrinking. I stayed inside most of the day, reading and drinking water. Around noon, I walked a bit up the ridge behind the cabin. From there, I could see the whole valley below. Not a single car, not one roof or power line. Just endless dry land and the faint shimmer of heat off the rocks. That night, something started to feel off. It was around 9 p.m. I was sitting outside again, just like the first night. The wind had picked up a little, and it was blowing sand across the ground in thin streams. I kept hearing little noises in the distance. Nothing loud, just dry crunching sounds, like twigs snapping or someone stepping on gravel. I told myself it was probably animals, rabbits or maybe even deer, but the noises didn't seem random. They moved, a little closer, then further, then closer again. I didn't see anything when I shined my flashlight toward the trees. I went back inside, bolted the door, and tried to sleep, but the sounds outside didn't stop. Every few minutes, I'd hear something scrape lightly across the wall or the porch. I sat up in my sleeping bag, holding my flashlight, heart beating harder every time it happened. The noises weren't aggressive, but they were consistent. Too steady for an animal, too cautious. Just before I started to drift off, I heard a soft crunch, like a boot heel pressing into dirt, right outside the window. I froze. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. My ears strained to catch every detail. Then I heard it again, another slow step. I got up quietly, crept to the window, and peeked through the edge of the curtain. There was someone standing about 10 feet from the window. They weren't facing the cabin, just standing sideways looking out toward the trees. Tall, thin shape, too thin. They didn't move at all, didn't sway or fidget, just stood there like they were listening. I stepped back. I didn't want to shine my light. I didn't want them to know I'd seen them. I stood there for what felt like an hour, listening, trying to understand what was going on. But after a while, the silence came back. I peeked again, and the figure was gone. The next morning, I walked around the cabin. I found footprints in the dirt, human-shaped, barefoot, but the toes looked weird, longer than normal, spread out like fingers. I kept telling myself it was just a prank, maybe some local messing with me, but I hadn't seen a single car or person in over 2 days, and nobody would hike out here just to scare someone. That day dragged on. I didn't eat much. I kept checking the windows. I didn't go hiking again. I stayed close. Around 6 p.m., I heard a low buzzing sound, like flies. I followed the sound to the edge of the trees behind the cabin. About 30 feet into the brush, I found the carcass of a deer. Its neck was twisted almost completely backward, and its legs were spread in an unnatural position, like something had dragged it there and then just left it. There were no bite marks,
No torn flesh.
but the body stank like it had been out in the sun for a week, even though the blood was still wet in places. That's when I knew I had to leave. I packed everything before sunset. I wanted to be ready to drive out the moment it got light. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the middle of the cabin, .45 in my lap, watching the windows, listening. The noises came back. First, the slow steps outside, then scratching on the walls, then something tapping the window glass like a finger. At one point, I swear I heard something move across the roof. I stayed frozen the whole time, waiting for the sun. Around 5 a.m., when the sky started to turn gray, everything went silent. Just like that. No footsteps.
No scratching.
Nothing. I didn't waste a second. I threw my gear into the truck, slammed the door shut, and peeled out of there without looking back. The road felt longer on the way out. My hands shook the whole time. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. I never told Marvin what happened. I just texted him a quick thanks and said the cabin was fine. But I didn't sleep for 2 nights after that. Every little sound made me jump. I kept thinking about those footprints, that dead deer, that thin figure standing in the dark. People out there sometimes talk about skinwalkers, shapeshifters, things that mimic people or animals. I don't believe in that kind of stuff. Still don't. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a story. It was someone or something real moving through those woods with a purpose. Watching me, studying me. It wasn't there to scare me. It was there to wait for something. And whatever it was, I don't think it wanted me to leave. But I did, and I've never gone back. I was 31 the summer I took some time off from my job in Flagstaff, Arizona. I'd worked in forestry for years, mostly dull paperwork at the district office, but I had accumulated enough vacation days to vanish for a while. I didn't tell many people, just packed up and drove north alone, looking to camp for a couple of weeks and clear my head. My plan was to explore parts of northern Arizona I hadn't been to before, places beyond the tourist maps, back roads that dead-ended into old woods and quiet valleys. I took my old 2001 Silverado, tossed a cooler in the back, my Remington 870 pump-action shotgun, a tent, some basic gear, and drove until the paved roads disappeared. It was on the second day that I came across the cabin. I was following a dirt trail, more like twin ruts through the brush, that curved along a ridge overlooking a wide, grassy basin. I'd passed a weathered sign nailed to a tree about a mile back, half covered in moss. The only legible word left was hill. I kept going, figuring I'd find a good place to camp eventually. But then the trees opened up and I saw it. The cabin sat on a low rise, maybe 100 yards from a rusted chain-link fence. The fence enclosed a graveyard. I could see the headstones through the trees, maybe a dozen of them, slanted, some broken, all overgrown. The place looked forgotten. Grass waist-high, no sign of a recent visitor. But the cabin itself didn't look completely ruined. The roof was still intact. There was a porch and the door was shut, shutters hanging loose but still attached. I pulled the truck off the trail and parked behind some junipers. Sat there for a bit, just looking. The place had that heavy kind of stillness you only find deep in the woods. No wind.
No birdsong.
Just the tick of my engine cooling. I figured I'd check it out before setting up camp. I wasn't planning on staying in the cabin. Just wanted to make sure it wasn't about to collapse or crawling with animals. I walked up the porch steps and tested the boards. They creaked but held. The front door opened easily.
No lock.
Inside, it smelled like dry rot and dust. The place was one big room with a wood stove near the corner, a narrow cot with the mattress eaten away by mice, a table with 2 chairs, and a few shelves nailed to the wall. Old mason jars lined the shelves. Most were empty. One had dried beans inside. Another looked like it had molasses hardened into black stone. I didn't stay long. I figured if the roof held, I could stash some gear inside and camp nearby. There was a small clearing behind the cabin where I could set up my tent. I spent the next 2 hours cleaning up. Picked up the beer cans and trash left by whoever had passed through last. Hauled a few branches out of the clearing. There was an old fire ring, half buried in pine needles, and I dug it out, stacked a fresh ring of stones, and gathered some kindling. By sundown, I had the tent up, a small fire going, and dinner heating in the pan, just beans and some sausage. That night was quiet, too quiet, in fact. I laid in my tent, listening for the usual nighttime forest sounds. Wind in the trees, bugs, coyotes, but there was nothing, just the steady crackle of my fire as it died down. Then silence so thick it made my ears feel stuffed. I told myself it was because I was off the beaten path. The silence was probably normal, but I still slept with the shotgun next to my bag, 1 round in the chamber, safety on. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the graveyard. The fence was rusted, and part of it had fallen down near the back. The graves were old. The newest date I found on a stone was from 1946. Most were earlier, 1911, 1889. A few stones didn't have names, just initials or nothing at all. It gave me the creeps, I won't lie, but I had no plans to dig around or disrespect the place. I just gave it space. My camp was far enough behind the cabin that I didn't have to look at it directly. I stayed out there for 3 days. During the day, I hiked, explored the hills, found game trails, marked my routes with orange ribbon so I wouldn't get turned around. At night, I read from a paperback or just sat by the fire, listening. But something wasn't right. On the second night, I came back from a long hike and found the cabin door open. I know I had shut it. It was a habit I had from years of backcountry work. Always close doors, even if no one's around. I figured it might have been wind or an animal, but the wind wasn't strong that day, and the door had a heavy hinge. Took effort to open. I stepped inside and checked. Nothing looked disturbed, but I started keeping the shotgun loaded from then on. On the third night, I was sitting by the fire when I thought I heard someone walking. It came from the direction of the graveyard. Slow steps through dry grass. I stood up and turned toward the sound. Didn't see anything, but I stayed there, heart thudding, for a solid 5 minutes, watching. No movement, no sound after that. I racked a shell into the shotgun just in case, but nothing came out of the dark. The next morning, I went over and found a trail. Not a clear one, just some trampled grass. It led from the broken fence, past the edge of the graveyard, and toward the woods. The grass was flattened in a way that suggested a single person had walked through. I followed it a bit, but it faded fast in the underbrush. That day, I packed up most of my gear. I wasn't scared exactly, but something about the place had started pressing on me, like a weight in the air. I figured I'd sleep one more night and head out in the morning. That last night was the worst. I didn't build a fire, wanted to avoid drawing attention. I stayed inside the tent, shotgun next to me, eyes open, ears straining. And just after midnight, I heard the footsteps again. This time they were closer. I could hear someone circling the tent. Dry grass crunching underfoot. Slow, deliberate. My mouth went dry. I sat up, holding the shotgun, safety off. Didn't move, just listened. The steps stopped directly behind the tent. Then I heard breathing. Not deep, heavy breaths. Just a slow exhale, like someone standing still, just outside the nylon. I held that position for what felt like forever. I didn't dare unzip the tent. Didn't make a sound. Then the breathing faded. The steps moved off. I stayed up until dawn. When I stepped out of the tent, I checked for prints. The ground was dry, so there wasn't much, but I found a few spots where the grass was flattened.
No hubo treads.
Just flat impressions. Barefoot, maybe. I wasn't sure. I walked over to the cabin and opened the door, and stopped cold. On the table inside, someone had left something. It was a mason jar, one of the empty ones from the shelf. But now it was filled with something dark. First, I thought it was just dirt, but as I got closer, I saw what was inside. Fingernail clippings, hair, what looked like small bones. Could have been from a bird or rabbit. Could have been human. I didn't stay long enough to check. I shut the door and backed away. I packed everything in 10 minutes. Threw the tent in the bed of the truck half rolled. Didn't even eat breakfast. I drove out of there fast, the tires slipping in the dirt. Didn't stop until I hit pavement again, 2 hours later. I never reported it. What could I say? That someone left a creepy jar and breathed on my tent? I drove back to Flagstaff. Told my coworkers I cut the trip short because of a stomach bug. But I kept thinking about that place, that graveyard, that cabin. Weeks later, I was in the city library doing research on something else when I decided to look it up. I didn't know the name of the area exactly, but I remembered the road sign, something hill. I eventually found it in an old topographic map from the 1940s. Granger Hill. It used to be a mining settlement. Around 1905, a small town was built there, 30 or so buildings, most cabins, one general store, and a graveyard. The town was abandoned by 1950. Then I found something that made my blood run cold. There was a short article from the Arizona Republic, dated July 3rd, 1951. Headline: Authorities investigate grave robbing in abandoned town. According to the piece, someone had dug up several graves in the Granger Hill Cemetery. Sheriff's deputies found open caskets, bones scattered. They suspected animal activity at first, but then they found signs of ritual behavior. Jars filled with human remains, small fires around the graves, carvings on the headstones. The case was never solved. The article ended by saying the area was closed off and forgotten. But it wasn't forgotten. Someone was still out there. Whoever they were, they didn't want me near that graveyard. And after that last night, I've never gone back. I still camp now and then, still love the woods, but I stay closer to known trails. I check maps more carefully, and when I see old cabins near graveyards, I keep on driving. Because some places aren't haunted by ghosts. They're haunted by people, real people, and those are the ones that can reach through your tent at night. My name's Lewis Carter. I was 32 years old at the time this happened, living in Reading, England. I used to work in construction, mostly small residential jobs and roofing gigs. I didn't have kids, wasn't married, just kind of kept to myself. Life got heavy that year. My mom had passed away in April, and I'd been left with all her belongings and no idea what to do with any of them. I felt burnt out, emotionally and physically, so I decided I'd get away for a week. No phone, no work, no people. I found this old cabin listing through a forum thread. It wasn't on Airbnb or anything formal, Just a guy named Trevor who had a small wooden cabin in Northumberland, deep near the edge of Kielder Forest. He said he used to rent it to hikers and hunters. It looked simple and quiet. There was no Wi-Fi, no mobile signal, and it was about a 25-minute drive to the nearest small village. That was exactly what I was looking for. I took the train up to Hexham and rented a small Vauxhall. The last part of the drive was along these narrow dirt tracks, barely wide enough for the car. On either side, there were thick trees, dark green and old, bending over the path like they'd been there forever. The woods had this heavy silence to them, even in daylight. That should have been my first sign. When I pulled up to the cabin, it was smaller than I expected. A single-room structure with a slanted roof and dark timber walls. There was an old iron stove inside, a single bed, a wooden table, and a few rusted tools hanging on the walls. There was a rainwater barrel outside, and a compost toilet about 20 feet away in a wooden outhouse. I unpacked, lit a fire in the stove, and settled in. I planned to hike in the mornings, cook simple meals, and just be alone with my thoughts. For the first couple of days, everything was uneventful. I'd go walking along the narrow forest paths, sometimes not seeing a soul for hours. I'd bring a flask and some food in a rucksack and just go as far as I could. Felt peaceful in a heavy, lonely kind of way. At night, I'd read a bit by the lantern or just stare into the flames. It was on the third day that I noticed her. That morning, I went down one of the lesser trails I hadn't explored yet. It was more overgrown than the others, and the forest felt thicker in that direction. I walked for maybe 2 hours before I found this old, abandoned stone shed, half buried in ivy. Just behind it, tucked between 2 massive ash trees, I saw someone. At first, I thought I was seeing things. She was standing completely still, facing away from me, wearing a faded blue coat, like the kind you'd see on an older woman in a village market. Her gray hair was long and wild, hanging below her shoulders. She didn't move, just stood there, like she was looking at something deeper in the trees. I didn't say anything, I don't know why. I just backed away, not even sure she saw me. It put a bad feeling in my stomach, like I'd stumbled onto something I wasn't meant to see. I didn't mention it in the journal I was keeping. I figured maybe she was a local out on a walk, or someone squatting out there. But it bothered me. That night, I couldn't sleep properly. Every creak in the cabin made me sit up and listen. The woods felt different, too quiet. The next morning, I woke up later than usual. I made coffee on the little camp stove and tried to shake it off. I didn't go back down that same trail, though. I walked in the opposite direction, toward a small ridge that looked over a clearing. I sat there for hours, just looking over the trees. On my way back, just as I was maybe a quarter mile from the cabin, I saw something in the mud. A footprint, not a boot, a bare foot. It was small, smaller than mine. The kind of print an older woman might make, narrow and bony. And it was fresh. You could see where the water had gathered in it, but it hadn't fully dried. The print faced toward my cabin. Now, I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was old and the rain just made it look fresh. Maybe it was a kid's print. But my gut knew better. I started walking faster. That evening, I kept the lantern lit longer than usual. I didn't open the window shutters like I usually did for air. I locked the door, even though it wouldn't stop anyone serious. It was just a wooden latch. I lay in bed with my ears tuned to every sound outside. Just after midnight, I heard something move outside. It was slow, like someone dragging their feet through leaves. I didn't move. I just stared at the ceiling, barely breathing. Then I heard it, a soft knock, not at the door, on the side of the cabin wall, near the back. One knock, then silence. I sat there for an hour before I got the courage to get up. I didn't go outside. I just stayed at the window with the lantern out, peeking through a crack in the shutters. But I didn't see anything. No light, no movement, nothing. The next day, I packed my things. I told myself I was just spooked, but I was done. It wasn't peaceful anymore. I wasn't sleeping, and every part of me wanted to be away from those woods. But when I went to start the car, the battery was dead. It had worked fine every day before. No lights left on. No sign of damage. I tried to jump it using a little portable charger I kept in the back. Nothing. Completely dead. Now I had no mobile signal, no working car, and the nearest proper road was hours away on foot. I considered staying another night and walking out in the morning, but I didn't trust the night anymore. So I left. I took only what I could carry, left the rest behind, and started walking the way I'd come in. I didn't make it far before I saw her again. This time, she wasn't far away, maybe 40 feet ahead, just off the path. Still, watching me. Her coat was muddy and torn now. Her face was thin and pale. Her eyes, I remember her eyes more than anything. They were wide, too wide, like she hadn't blinked in minutes. She didn't look away, just watched me, like she was studying something in me. I didn't say a word. I didn't run. I just kept walking. I didn't look back until I got to the bend in the path, and when I did, she was gone. It took me over 5 hours to reach the nearest road. A man in a white van finally picked me up and gave me a ride into Bellingham. I didn't tell him what happened. I just said my car broke down and thanked him. I took a bus from there, then a train the next morning, and I never went back. Weeks later, I looked up news stories or missing persons in that area. Nothing. No reports of anyone matching her description. No deaths. No sightings. It's like she didn't exist. I told Trevor, the guy who owned the cabin, that the car had died and I had to leave early. He didn't seem surprised, didn't ask questions. I still don't know who she was. I don't know if she lived out there, hiding in the trees, or if she was just some strange hermit. But I think she was watching me from the beginning. I think she saw me arrive. I think she waited until I let my guard down. And I think if I'd stayed another night, something worse might have happened. Now, every time I walk alone, I check the treeline more carefully. I look for shapes in the woods, and every so often, I dream of that muddy footprint facing toward the cabin, toward me. And in the dream, I never wake up before I hear the knock. Just one knock, then silence. It was late October of 2019, and I had taken a week off from work to spend some time out in the hills north of Missoula, Montana. I was 34 at the time, single, and I'd spent most of the past few years slowly distancing myself from the noise of city life. After my dad passed away in 2017, I started to think more about the kind of life I wanted to live, and sitting in traffic or staring at spreadsheets wasn't really part of it. He had left me a little bit of land, just under 6 acres, tucked away past a winding, unmarked dirt road that ran through old logging forest. No power, no running water, nothing but trees, hills, and silence. That fall, I decided I was finally going to build a small cabin on the property. I didn't have big plans, just something simple, about 12 by 16 feet, a sloped tin roof, maybe a little loft to sleep in, and a wood stove for the cold months. I wasn't a contractor or anything, but I knew enough from YouTube, books, and helping my uncle with his garage build that I felt confident I could get the shell up in a week if I pushed myself. I drove my truck up there with a trailer full of lumber, tools, camping gear, and a big blue tarp. I figured I'd sleep in the truck bed under the tarp while I worked. The weather looked decent, but that high up, things could change fast. By the second day, I had cleared a flat enough space to start digging for concrete deck blocks. I didn't pour a slab or anything fancy, just leveled the blocks, framed the base, and started laying the floor joists. The soil was full of rocks and tree roots, and I spent hours just swinging a pickaxe and clearing space by hand. Every muscle in my back ached by the time the sun dropped behind the ridge. The nearest neighbor was almost 2 miles away, and my phone barely worked up there. Just a flicker of signal if I stood on a rock near the road. That was fine by me. I wanted the isolation. I brought a solar panel and battery setup to charge my flashlight and phone in case I needed GPS or weather updates. But mostly I liked the quiet. The third night it started raining. Not heavy at first, just a steady tapping on the tarp stretched over the bed of my truck. I was sore, dirty, and too tired to care. I closed my eyes and fell asleep with the sound of rain on plastic and the faint wind moving through the trees. By morning, the rain hadn't stopped. I made some coffee on my little propane burner and sat in the cab of the truck while the windows fogged up. I didn't want to waste time, so I pulled on a rain jacket and got to work anyway. The mud clung to everything, and I slipped more than once trying to walk across the now half-soggy site. I managed to finish nailing down the floorboards by afternoon and even stood up the first 2 wall frames before the wind started picking up. It felt colder than it should have. The rain turned from misty drizzle to sharp, slanting lines that hit my face hard enough to sting. I decided to call it for the day and went back to the truck, soaked through my jacket. I peeled off my wet clothes and wrapped myself in a sleeping bag in the back of the truck. I had enough propane left to heat a small space for a little while, so I cracked a window, fired it up, and let the warmth settle into my bones. That night, the wind got louder. Not just loud, but erratic. It would blow steady for a minute, then suddenly stop, then rush again from another direction. I kept waking up, half expecting to hear a tree crack and fall nearby. The tarp flapped so hard against the truck it sounded like something hitting it. I told myself it was just wind and rain, but sometime after midnight, I heard something else. It wasn't the wind or the rain. It was slower, heavier. I stayed still in my sleeping bag, listening. It sounded like someone stepping in mud. Slow, deliberate squelches like boots pulling up from wet ground. Maybe 6 or 7 steps, then nothing. Then again, closer this time. Not fast, just steady. I sat up slowly, reached for my flashlight, and clicked it on. I pointed it through the wet, fogged up plastic window of the tarp, but couldn't see anything clearly. I killed the light. My heart was beating faster now. I told myself it was probably a deer. I'd seen signs of elk and moose all around the property. Maybe something wandered close to the truck. But deer don't stop like that. They don't just stand there for minutes and then take 3 more steps. And no deer walks directly around a truck like they're looking at it. At around 2 a.m., I heard something knock gently against the driver's side door. Not hit it, not bang, just tap, once, then silence. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. By morning, the rain had stopped, but everything was soaked. I crawled out of the back of the truck and looked around. The mud was torn up in places from where I'd been walking, but something else caught my eye about 10 feet from the passenger side. A single boot print. Deep, too deep to be mine. I wear a size 10. This was bigger, wider, the kind of print you'd expect from someone 6 feet 2 inches or taller. It was just one print, though. I walked around the truck slowly, looking. I found 2 more behind it, both facing the tailgate. No tracks going away from the truck. I told myself again that it had to be a trick of the light. Maybe they were mine from earlier and got washed into strange shapes by the rain. I wanted to believe that, but I couldn't. That day, I forced myself to keep working. I stood the rest of the walls and tied them in with temporary braces. I was distracted the whole time, constantly glancing into the trees. The forest looked different when it was wet. Darker, heavier. Sound didn't travel the same. It felt like everything was muffled. Even the birds were quiet. Around 4 p.m., I heard a branch snap. Not just crack. Snap. Loud. Close. I stood on the platform with a hammer in my hand, staring into the trees in the direction of the sound. Nothing moved. I kept looking for 20 minutes before I picked up my saw and kept going. I didn't want to sleep in the truck again that night. It was too exposed. I had 3 walls up, so I threw a tarp across the top and nailed it into the wall frames. I slept inside the shell of the cabin, wrapped in my sleeping bag with the hammer next to me. It didn't feel any safer. At around 1 a.m., I woke up to a noise I couldn't explain. Not a step, not a knock, something like fabric scraping across wood. I held my breath and waited. The rain had picked up again, and the tarp above me shifted and snapped in the wind. Then I heard it again, this time just outside the back wall. Something was brushing along the outside of the cabin. Slow, deliberate. I sat up, every muscle in my body stiff. I reached for my flashlight again and aimed it at the crack between the floor and the back wall. I saw a shadow move. Not big, not small, just a shape, too far back to make out details. But it was moving slow, passing by the edge of the wall. I didn't move. I waited nearly 20 minutes, listening, watching that gap. Then, nothing. By morning, I was done. I packed up my tools, threw the tarp back over the truck bed, and sat behind the wheel for a long time just staring at the woods in front of me. I didn't see anything, but I knew someone had been there. I drove back into town and stayed with a friend for the rest of the week. I didn't say much. I didn't want to sound crazy. I told him the weather had gotten worse than I planned, and I'd come back to finish it later. A few weeks passed before I went back. I brought a friend with me that time. Big guy, used to be a bouncer. We spent 2 more days putting on the roof and sealing the walls. He joked about the mud and the quiet. I didn't laugh. That second night, it rained again, but nothing strange happened. Maybe whoever it was saw I wasn't alone and kept their distance. I don't know who they were. Maybe just someone camping nearby. Maybe a hunter who thought I was on his land. Maybe a squatter who didn't want company. But whoever it was, they walked around my truck. They stood outside my unfinished cabin at night. They tapped on the door and didn't leave any trail out. They weren't trying to hurt me, at least not then. But they wanted me to know they were there. That cabin's finished now. I use it a few times each year. I installed a steel door, motion lights powered by solar, and I carry every time I stay overnight. But I've never gone back there alone. Not since that night, and I never will. My name's Brian Hale. Back in 2016, I was 34 years old and living alone in northern Arkansas. I was working for a small timber company. Mostly I handled chainsaw work and oversaw deliveries. I didn't mind the long days out in the trees. I liked being by myself. People exhausted me. I didn't care for loud places or crowded cities. I liked the woods. I liked silence. That year, my boss, a guy named Rick who owned about 400 acres of timberland, told me to check out an old logging site we hadn't used in years. He said if the roads were clear and the ground wasn't too soft, he might want us to start using it again. But first, I had to go out there and assess everything. He also mentioned there was still an old one-room cabin out there we used to use for equipment storage, back before we got trailers and all that. He said I could stay overnight and take my time, maybe spend 2 or 3 days making notes, clearing trails, and taking measurements. I figured it would be a good break from the usual grind. I liked that kind of work. No one breathing down my neck, just me, my tools, and the trees. So on a Thursday morning, I loaded up my truck with gear, chainsaw, fuel, measuring tape, axe, a cooler full of food, and a sleeping bag. I even brought a folding chair and some extra clothes, just in case it rained. It was early October and the forecast looked decent. Cold at night, but dry. Perfect weather for being in the woods. The drive to that old site took about 3 hours. Most of it was on back roads, then a rough dirt trail that wound up through the hills. It was the kind of place people didn't go unless they had a reason. No cell signal, no lights at night, just thick woods and silence. When I finally reached the old trailhead, I had to park my truck and go the last 2 miles on foot. The logging road was too overgrown to drive. I didn't mind. I strapped my gear to a dolly and pulled it behind me. The walk-in was quiet. Just dry leaves under my boots, a few birds here and there. I passed some old stumps and rusted barrels, things we'd left behind years ago. Everything smelled like pine and old dirt. There was something peaceful about it. When I reached the cabin, I was surprised it was still standing. It was rough-looking. Weathered boards, patches of moss on the roof, and a busted gutter hanging off the side. But it hadn't collapsed. The front door was crooked, but it opened. Inside, there was an old cot, a few busted chairs, some rusty tools, and a little wood-burning stove in the corner. The floorboards creaked but held my weight. It wasn't much, but it would do. I spent the rest of the day walking the perimeter of the site, checking out the old haul roads and flagging any trees that had fallen. There were signs of animal activity, mostly deer and raccoon, and a few larger tracks I couldn't quite identify. Maybe a black bear. I made a mental note to keep my food sealed up. By sunset, I was beat. I cooked a can of stew on my camp stove, unrolled my sleeping bag on the cot, and sat in the doorway for a while as the last light faded through the trees. It got cold fast. I could see my breath by 8 o'clock. There were no lights anywhere, just black woods stretching in every direction and the sound of wind moving through the trees. I slept okay the first night. Woke up once or twice because of branches falling or small animals skittering across the leaves outside, but nothing unusual. The next day I got back to work. I cleared 2 old trails, chopped through a bunch of thick brush, and flagged off a section where the ground had eroded. Around noon, I found something odd. A pile of old beer cans and a torn tarp. Looked like someone had been camping out there at some point in the last year or two. Could have been hunters, but it was strange they left that much behind. Most hunters don't litter, especially not in the middle of nowhere. I kept going, didn't think much of it. That night, though, things felt different. It started with a smell. Around 9 o'clock, as I was sitting on the cot reading an old map, I caught a whiff of something foul, like rotting meat. It was faint, but strong enough to notice. I stepped outside with my flashlight and looked around the cabin. Nothing. No animals, no blood, no tracks. I figured maybe something had died in the woods nearby, but the smell lingered for hours. I could still catch it in the air around midnight. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing soft crunching noises outside. Not animals scurrying, but slower, more deliberate, like someone walking, stopping, then walking again. But every time I turned on my flashlight and looked out the window, I saw nothing. I told myself it was probably just my nerves, maybe deer or a coyote moving around. But deep down, something felt off. The next morning, I got up early and decided to walk the ridge behind the cabin. It was steep and rocky, not part of the usual logging area, but I wanted to check it out. As I climbed, I found a small clearing halfway up. In the middle of the clearing was a black plastic trash bag, just sitting there, tied shut. I stared at it for a long time. It hadn't been there the day before. I was sure of it. I didn't open it. I don't know why. I just stood there, looking at it, then backed away. My gut told me to leave it alone. I walked back to the cabin slowly. I kept checking over my shoulder. I didn't see anyone, but I felt watched, like something just beyond the trees was following me. Back at the cabin, I packed up most of my gear. I told myself I'd leave in the morning, finish my notes that afternoon, and head out first thing. I didn't feel right staying another night, but it was too late to hike out by then. I was tired and I didn't want to walk 2 miles in the dark. That evening was the worst. Just after dusk, I was sitting in the cabin with the lantern on, writing in my logbook, when I heard a thud against the back wall. Not loud, but clear, like a fist against wood. I froze. Then came another one. I stood up, turned off the lantern, and waited in the dark, listening. My heart was pounding. I crept over to the window and looked out. There was nothing there. No movement, no light, just the dark woods and the sound of leaves rustling. But I knew something had been there. Around midnight, I heard footsteps again. Not fast, slow, crunching through leaves, circling the cabin, then stopping. I held my breath. Then I heard it, a soft metallic sound, like something scraping against the front door handle. I grabbed my axe and moved to the corner of the room, heart racing, hands sweating. I waited like that for over an hour. The noise didn't come back. No more steps, no more sounds. At first light, I opened the door and walked out with my axe raised. Nothing, no tracks, no signs of anyone. But when I walked around the side of the cabin, I saw something that made my stomach twist. 3 scratch marks, deep, deliberate, carved into the wood beside the window. Not animal scratches. These were long, slow, and intentional, like someone dragging a knife. That was it. I didn't care about finishing the notes. I didn't care about the job. I packed my bag in 10 minutes, strapped it to the dolly, and started walking. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. When I got back to town, I went straight to Rick's office. I told him the site was no good. Roads were too far gone, too much erosion, not worth the trouble. I never mentioned the trash bag, the noises, or the scratches, and I never went back. A month later, I read a small article in the local paper. Hikers found a burned-out fire ring and some human remains in the woods outside Jasper, about 20 miles from where I'd stayed. No ID, no suspects. Authorities assumed it was a runaway or a drifter, maybe someone who got lost. But part of me always wondered if it was connected. If that trash bag I found had something inside it I didn't want to see. If whoever had circled my cabin had left more than just scratches at other places. I still work in the woods, still cut trees, still walk trails, still sleep in cabins sometimes, but never in that area, and never alone if I can help it. I don't scare easy, but something was out there, not a ghost, not a monster, just a person. And I've learned that people, real people, are the scariest thing in the woods.